Hello, everyone, and welcome to this webinar. As you know, or most of you will know, this is actually a format that started at the end of April, this series of webinars we're doing. It was planned as a substitute for the conference that the ILCN and the ELCN had planned for the end of April in Barcelona. So this first webinar of the series started on the 50th anniversary of Earth Day. And we have been going ever since on a weekly format, and it has really grown into quite a very interesting and inspiring series. At least I find that. And in a way, we've developed a format that has reached more people than we would have been able to reach in Barcelona. So we really have taken full advantage of the challenges that were presented to us in these times. So thanks for tuning in today. Today's topic is about cross-boundary cooperation, and it's a perfect example because it's about the conservation of freshwater resources in large watersheds. So in a way, it's really showing the necessity for global cooperation in land conservation. And it also shows that you need dedicated and motivated individuals who push these administrative and jurisdictional boundaries when they try to implement their visions to reclaim large-scale freshwater resources. With that, I will hand it over to Jim. I would just like to thank everyone who's contributing to this webinar today. First and foremost, our speakers. They all do this pro bono in their spare time, and it's a sign of their dedication that they volunteer to share their insights from their practical work with us and you as the audience. I'd also like to thank the staff of the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy, who is organizing the series on behalf of the ILCN and the ELCN. And in particular, I'd like to thank Janina Walke, the program director of the ILCN, and Jim Levitt, the president, so to speak, of the ILCN. And with that, I'll hand it over to you, Jim.
Thank you, Tillman. I really want to return the compliment and thank you for bringing all the energy that the ELCN has contributed to this webinar series on multiple occasions. We really do have an international forum going here with people from South America, North America, Europe, Africa, Asia, and Australia participating. And it has been a remarkable journey to pivot from what we hope to be a wonderful celebration in Barcelona to this 10-week webinar series that has attracted people from far and near. I simply want to recount the fact that since our first Global Congress of the ILCN in Berlin, Germany in 2015, we have been focusing in on freshwater resources and how to track them and manage them. I remember that Jeff Allenby, who was working with the Chesapeake Conservancy, gave a wonderful speech that got responses from Australia, New Zealand, and South America immediately, and that just was an early indication of the strength of our interest in this topic. In Santiago in 2017 and in 2018, we had a small meeting on conservation finance and then a larger global congress. We had a number of freshwater resource presentations, a particularly good one from Mariana Ramirez from the Nature Conservancy on some of the pioneering water trusts in northern South America that really have led the way for the whole world in this field. And that today at the Lincoln Institute, we have a member of our Board of Trustees, Adriana Soto, who's quite interested in water funds and who pioneered that practice again in Northern South America. We have our colleagues at the Babbitt Center who are working right now on, especially on the Colorado River and its impact on land use throughout the Southwest United States. And our partners at places like the Chesapeake Conservancy, who will be participating in the next round of the Large Landscape Peer Learning Initiative, with a focus on how the Chesapeake, which is our largest freshwater estuary in North America, is integral to so many metropolitan and rural communities in the eastern part of North America, including Washington, D.C., Baltimore, and the Susquehanna River Valley. So this is something which refreshes itself every time we get online, every time we have a conference, which we're very proud to have the group of scholars and practitioners who are presenting today. And Chani, if you can give me the next slide. Today, our guests are Jaime Camacho, who's Water Strategy Coordinator for the Nature Conservancy in Ecuador, Fernando Coz, who is Executive Director of the Fundación Chile Lagos Limpios, Adam Livingston, Director of Planning and Policy for the Sequoia Riverlands Trust, Eva Weihinger, who is Project Manager for the European Land Conservation Network based in the Berlin area in Germany, and Spencer Meyer, who is Senior Conservationist for the Heisted Foundation based in Connecticut and working on a large project in the state of Maine in the United States. So with no further ado, I want to introduce my newfound friend, Fernando Coz. I'm sorry, I got the order mixed up. Jaime Camacho, and Jaime is presenting on behalf of himself and Galo Medina to talk about water funds as an opportunity for critical ecosystem conservation. Jaime, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much, Jim. Good morning, good afternoon to everybody. As Jim said, I'm going to present this presentation about water funds as a critical and as an opportunity for critical ecosystem conservation. I do this on behalf of Galo Medina and myself as members of the Nature Conservancy, a part of the Latin American Water Fund Partnership. Next, please. And I want to start the presentation with three very basic and simple questions, but these questions are the ones that inspired the water funds as a strategy of financing watersheds. And the first one is that water is essential for human life and well-being. Next, please. Of course, we need water for our growing cities. You know, the cities, the urban areas are growing in the world, and we need the water for drinking, for cleaning. Even in this pandemic, the water is more necessary than ever. But we also need the water for the rural areas. Next, please. Of course, we have food that comes from water, direct protein like shrimp, fish, but we also need the water to produce our food. So it's important for our food security. The next one, please. Other uses, very important, transportation. Waterways are very important for our transportation, and waters are also very important for our recreation. Next, please. And finally, but not last, water is crucial and very important for biodiversity conservation, not only for the living things that live in the water, but also amphibians and other plants that depend on water for their living. And of course, and very important is that we as human beings have this cultural attachment to water. No, our settlements are related to water. We need to manage water for floods and droughts. So it's very important and essential. Next, please. The second idea is that water comes from nature. We all in this conference probably know this. The next one, please. But it's very important to understand that water it comes from the ecosystems, where we have waterfalls, we have paramours, we have different types of glaciers, different types of forests. And water comes from the ecosystems. The next one, please. And the third and very important thing is that protecting and restoring those ecosystems has costs. The next one, please. We need to, in order to protect these lands, we need to create infrastructure. We need delimitation, monitoring, surveillance, restoration, and everything has a cost. So there's where water funds come. The next, please. And we think, we really think that water funds are a solution to the need of investment in watershed protection. The next one, please. So what's a water fund? Water funds, it's mainly a financial mechanism that allows put the money that to protect the watershed. So big users like cities or even food production areas can put the money in a special trust or in a place in where we can invest that money in the natural ecosystems. Of course, in those natural ecosystems, we have people that live there. So it's very important to work with them to protect the ecosystems and then deliver fresh and good quality water for the users. And that's the main concept of a water fund. And the next one, please. As Jim said, one of the first water funds that we as TNC were involved was the creation of the water fund of Quito in Ecuador in 2000. Now we have around 41 water funds being created in the whole world. And we have, for example, in 30 countries in Latin America. But we also have already water funds in Africa. We're working on Asia and start something in Europe. So the idea is working in many places. The next one, please. And what's the relation between the water funds and the land protection? And this is very important. A lot of the things that water funds do to protect the ecosystems are not done in water. There are land protection activities. So in order to protect the water, to have good quality, good quantity, less sediments, we need the protection of the land where the water comes in. And here what we have is a map of an example of how water funds work. So we have this watershed. This is the watershed of the Paute River in Ecuador. And then we have a planning process in which we determine which are the best areas to protect the water that we need. In this watershed, for example, there is agriculture, there are big cities, there is an important electricity production for the whole country. So what we do is determine these areas of protection and go there to work, and that's very important. In order to protect that land, as I told you, we have to work with different stakeholders. We need to work with local governments. We need to work with indigenous communities, with local communities, with big landowners. So they all work together in this protection of the land. And even some of the water funds support the management of protected areas, formal protected areas. The next one, please. Here are some examples of some of the activities, physical protection. The next one, please. We also work on restoration, some active restoration, reforestation. The next one, please. But also passive restoration, eliminating the threat and letting the nature come by itself. But also, the next one, please. Of course, to do this in the natural ecosystems, we have to support the communities that live on those places. So we work with them in productive activities like milk production or vicuña growing, irrigation, tourism, and whatever is needed for the people to help us protect the land where the water comes from. The next one, please. So here are some numbers. This is for Latin America. We have 50 million hectares of interventions for water funds in the whole Latin America. We have more than 230,000 hectares of conservation, more than 50,000 hectares of ecological restoration, active and passive, and around 100 million people live in the watersheds impacted by these water funds. So it's important, not only it's important for the land conservation, but it's most important for the people that live there. And we have around 50,000 direct beneficiaries of the activities I have shown you in the previous slides. And some elements of success of the water funds, it's very important to have transparency. That's one of the key issues of the water funds. Everyone knows where the money comes from and where it is invested. Another important thing is that the invest is exclusively in water protection. We don't do development. I mean, we do some collateral things, but the main objective is always water protection. As I told you, stakeholder integration is very important, working with central government, local governments, indigenous communities, universities. So we have a lot of stakeholders working together. And of course, it's very important to set tangible results. And so we know what we're reaching and what we have. And for that, we have science. The science we need for planning, the science we need to monitor what we do. The next one, please. So what I want to emphasize to end this presentation is that protecting the watershed for water, it's very important because we also are protecting biodiversity. So all the efforts we do to protect the watersheds also help biodiversity. We are also working in places where there is called carbon sequestration. So we are storing carbon and avoiding the emissions. We also work reducing risk of natural resources, contributing to climate change adaptation, providing recreation opportunities for many stakeholders, foster some economic development, and of course, preserve natural values. And that's why it's important to do this watershed conservation through the water funds. The key issue is that with water funds, we can finance that land protection in the long term. And thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Jaime, for being so comprehensive and hold on one second. So comprehensive and so concise in your presentation. You came in right on time, which we really appreciate. I can't emphasize enough how important water funds have become across the globe in helping communities innovate for their water supplies and innovate in a way that spreads equity across communities. Water funds can help communities that are far upstream of the major metropolitan areas, in rural areas, and downstream in the metropolitan areas where people's lives depend on the delivery of that water. So keep your eye on this innovation. My suspicion is that in coming decades, it will be increasingly important on 6 continents. It's now my pleasure to introduce Fernando Cos, who helped to invent and is now running Chile Lagos Limpios, which means clean lakes, beautiful, pristine lakes in Chile. In a very short period of time, he has gotten a tremendous amount of support in Chile and in the United States for the concept that he is going to present to us now. Fernando.
Thank you very much, Jim. First of all, I would like to thank the International Land Conservation Network and the European Land Conservation Network for the opportunity to present the work we're doing in Chile and to share this stand with such distinguished guests. So today I'm going to talk about conservation and development, the interrelationship between those two concepts in the northern Patagonian lakes of Chile. Go ahead, next slide, please. So for those of you that don't know Chile, it's a long and narrow country in South America. It's around 4,300 kilometers long, which is more or less the distance between San Francisco and New York. And these lakes, which we're going to talk about, these watersheds, are located in 3 of what we call the Northern Patagonian region, which is just before Patagonia. Next slide, please. So what are the Northern Patagonian lakes? These are 23 lakes. As you can see in this Google Earth map, it's a unique territory. It's a beautiful piece of land with a major natural value, but as well it's a strategic water reserve, not only for Chile, but for Latin America, especially in a context of climate change and desertification. Next slide, please. So just some facts and figures. As I said, these are 23 lakes. It represents around 30% of Chile's freshwater mirror. It's part of watersheds that represent around 35,000 square kilometers that are the first transnational watersheds. So watersheds that start in Argentina and end up in Chile. 2 of the 3 largest lakes, and which are located in 3 of the poorest regions of Chile. So not only it's a region with a big natural value, but it's a region that's asking for development, for job creation, and for investment. But of course, not at any cost. Next slide. So in this territory, we're facing planning crisis due to rapid development in the last 150 years. If you go back to the mid-1800s, these lakes were inhabited only by indigenous communities, and there was practically no development. Later on, the forestry, the timber industry arrived. Later on, agriculture, such as dairy farming, crops, and nowadays even vineyards because of the change of climate. And most recently, tourism and second homeowners and services. So there's been a rapid change in the economic dynamic and in the development. And this happened in a territory that didn't have the proper regulatory framework nor the institutionality to cope with this rapid development. So next slide, please. We've been facing in the last years some environmental degradation and some social conflicts in this beautiful territory, such as some examples are wastewater discharges in some of the lakes, real estate development projects that have been frozen because of conflicts, beaches that have been closed in the middle of the summer, and most recently, a very dramatic case, Lake Villarrica, which is one of the most typical tourism lakes in the south of Chile, was declared a saturate zone. That means that it's contaminated, and currently the Ministry of Environment is developing the first environmental remediation plan for a lake in Chile. Please go ahead. So back in 2018, me and 2 partners from Land Group, which is an environmental planning and design agency, decided to do a seminar in Panguipulli to bring the success case of Lake Tahoe and explain that there are solutions, there are best practice, and there are experience in the world to face these issues. Next slide, please. So we brought people representative from the University of California, Davis, from the NGO Keep Tahoe Blue, and from the Tahoe Regional Planning Agency, representing science, advocacy, nonprofits, and the public sector to explain how this lake that faced similar issues back in the 1960s were able to collaborate and were able to work together to find a balance between economic development and protection of this water. Go ahead, please. So the event was a success. Lots of people were there. It was there was a lot of interest. So we decided to fund this nonprofit, which is called Chile Lagos Limpios. that works in the conservation, development, and climate change adaptation of the northern Patagonian lakes through a science and environmental education approach to inform planning, public policy, and private actions. Please go ahead. So we're a small but strong team. As I said, we funded this with Cristobal and Angela, that they are funding partners of Land Group. Next slide, please. We've got a mix of expertise. We've got a board that's made half by representatives from Tahoe and by representatives of Chile. We call it a technical board because we've got expertise in climate change, development, urban planning, hydrology, the public sector, et cetera, et cetera. This board provides us strategic guidelines for our work. Next slide, please. We've got two main work areas. Next slide. One has to do with science and monitoring. We're bringing together or bringing to Chile the expertise of the Tahoe Environmental Research Center from the University of California, Davis. And in collaboration with a local consortium of universities, we're working, next slide, please, in adapting this knowledge to the Chilean reality. So we've installed instruments in some lakes, in some pilot lakes, to develop models, hydrodynamic models, that can help us simulate physical process and understand how lakes move. And when you understand how lakes move, the hydrodynamic of a lake, you can simulate and develop scenarios of how contaminants would move. And when you understand how contaminants would move, you can also understand what land use around the watershed can have an impact in a determined way of a lake. Lakes are complex ecosystems. They're all different. So different land use and developments can affect in a different way, different lakes, or one lake in different areas. Next slide, please. So just this slide wants to show the blue line represents the volume of water in a lake, and the red line represents the size of the watershed. So you see that there are some small lakes like Panguipulli that have a small volume of water, but a huge watershed. Why is this important to understand? Because what happens in the watershed will affect the lake's water quality. Next slide, please. So we're currently monitoring Lake Ranco. We installed instruments back in September 2019 in collaboration with two local organizations. Next slide, please. And together with other inputs like the lake's bathymetry, meteorological conditions, we are currently modeling, that's our pilot case, we're modeling in California, the hydrodynamic of these lakes. So we're having results in the next few weeks. Next slide, please. Next slide, some fancy graphs to show the scientific work behind the models. Next slide, please. We're also doing the same thing in Lake Panguipulli. Next slide. And in Lake LLANQUIHUE, we are currently designing a project in collaboration with AquaChile. AquaChile is the second largest aquaculture company in the world. And they historically had concessions of salmon production in the lake. And as a corporate decision, they recently decided to take the fish out of the lake and produce them inland and destined these concessions for scientific purposes. So we're developing a strategic partnership in order to do a world-class monitoring program similar to the one in Tahoe in Lake LLANQUIHUE, which is also a very interesting case because it has 4 urban centers and it has had environmental problems in the last couple of years. Next slide, please. Our second area of work is advocacy, and it's very complementary with science. One doesn't exist without the other. Next slide. And we divide this area in 3 sub-areas. One has to do with environmental education. How can we transmit this technical and scientific information into common language? And how can we use this to develop campaigns in order to change or influence the way that companies and citizens and second homeowners use and enjoy these lakes? Second area has to do with media and communications. It's very important to position the Lagos Limpios, maintaining our lakes clean, both at a national and international level. And this is why this seminar is so important for us, and we're happy to participate. And we have presence in the media, radio, seminars, etc. And the third line of work has to do with governance. As I said, one of the triggers of this planning crisis is due to not proper institutionality. There are serious coordination failures between public agencies and private companies and civil groups. So we're trying to bring them together in the different watersheds in order to develop a common vision and develop a strategic roadmap that can put together and align the different efforts for development. As public policy takes a while to be developed, it's a long-term action, and working from the base it's very important. Next slide, please. These are going to go fast. I've got 2 minutes left. This is one of the campaigns we did last year that had to do with taking care of wetlands and water contamination, some presence in the media. Next slide, please. Next slide. Some of the stakeholders that we've worked. Last year, we met with more than 140 organizations from different groups. Next slide. Just to finish, some key messages. I want to emphasize that northern Patagonian lakes are a strategic water resource for Chile and Latin America, especially in a climate change scenario. This planning crisis triggers the need to anticipate and adapt more than remediate. Remediate costs a lot of money, there's a lot of conflict and takes a lot of effort, so anticipating to this, it's very important. We are, as an organization, we promote economic development, and we want to find, and we believe that there's possibility to balance economic development and environmental protection. Actually, environmental protection is a trigger for economic development, and we want to transfer some of the aspects of the Tahoe governance model and scientific expertise to Chile. Thank you very much for this opportunity, and I'm looking forward to the questions.
Thank you so much, Fernando. I just want to reemphasize that Fernando is a master of partnerships. I really first was introduced to the importance of his work by a member of his board named Tu Jarvis in California, who's on the faculty of University of California, Davis. And as you could see from that slide, with 140 partnerships in the public sector, in the private sector, in the NGO sector, in the academic sector, that Fernando has really done a tremendous job at pulling together the resources from so many different places to protect these beautiful lakes that I've had a chance to see. He's really doing important pioneering work that perhaps borrows on some of the experience that came out of California, but is pioneering this whole practice in this part of the world. I want to also add that at the end of these presentations, we're going to take questions from all of you, and you can begin to enter them now in the Q&A section in the icon at the bottom of your screen. So please feel free to start stacking up questions, and Tillman and I at the end will begin to take questions. Our next speaker is Adam Livingston. He is Director of Planning and Policy at the Sequoia Riverlands Trust. Adam comes to this work with a tremendous amount of training. He has a Bachelor of Arts in Philosophy and Classics from Xavier University. He graduated from the Yale Law School with a Juris Doctor, and he is a Master of Environmental Science and Management from the Bren School at the University of California, Santa Barbara. So he's very well qualified to do this work, which is crafting policy approaches for freshwater in California's San Joaquin Valley. Adam, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you. And I want to thank the ILCN for putting on this panel. And certainly I'm looking forward to seeing many of you in person in Barcelona, hopefully next spring. And I also want to, before I get started, acknowledge Scott Butterfield from the Nature Conservancy. This presentation is based in part on a talk that he and I gave at Land Trust Alliance conference last fall. So you know, TNC is, as you'll hear, you know, one of our most important partners in this work. So just wanted to acknowledge them as well. Next slide. So just a quick overview. I'm going to give some background on the San Joaquin Valley, which is the region of California where Sequoia Riverlands Trust works. Some of the challenges that the San Joaquin Valley has seen in terms of groundwater depletion and the response to those challenges at the state and regional level, and ultimately the implications in terms of farmland retirement, and basically the conversion of a significant portion of the region's irrigated cropland to less water intensive uses, and the opportunities that might open up in terms of landscape scale conservation and restoration. So next slide. So chances are, if you've heard of the San Joaquin Valley at all, it's probably in the context of agriculture. It's commonly called the salad bowl of America. It has some of the most productive agricultural land on the planet. It grows literally hundreds of crops, and often a majority of US or even world production of, you know, of particular fruits, vegetables, and nut crops. Agriculture is a huge part of the economy, and this 8-county region basically it brings in over $36 billion a year just in crop receipts, and much more than that, counting jobs and revenue from production and processing. But all of this has come at a significant cost. Ecologically, I mean, it's one of the most highly altered landscapes in the US, but it is still of great ecological importance. It has the highest density of endangered species habitat in the US, among other things. And there's been a significant cost in terms of water, because this is naturally a semi-arid region, particularly in the southern San Joaquin Valley. Water basically comes from 3 sources: snowmelt from the neighboring Sierra Nevada mountains, imported water, which is to say, you know, water that is pumped in from other parts of the state, and groundwater. And increasingly, as the other 2 sources of water have become less reliable, basically, you know, the difference has been made up by unsustainable levels of groundwater pumping. And you can see on the next slide, this is actually from a study done by American Farmland Trust and Conservation Biology Institute towards the end of the 2011 to 2017 drought. And basically they looked at the most productive farmland in the region and the areas under the most water stress. And you can see, particularly in the southern San Joaquin Valley, the bright red areas where highly productive farmland overlaps with areas under significant water stress. And looking at the region as a whole, I mean, really, there's only a small portion at the very northern end where there's not significant water stress. So next slide, please. So the state's response to this, when the problem basically became impossible to ignore during the drought, was a series of bills collectively called the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act. A full description of SGMA would be a presentation all on its own, but the basic outline is SGMA requires the formation of local agencies called groundwater sustainability agencies. And each of these agencies has to develop a plan showing how it's going to bring the area under its jurisdiction bring groundwater use in line with sustainable supplies over a 20-year time period. And the 20 years actually started this January, so 2020 to 2040. And next slide, please. And the eventual result of this is going to be large-scale farmland retirement. Many of the groundwater sustainability agencies are, understandably, from the point of view of farmers and the economic disruption that this will cause, trying to put that off as long as possible. But in the long term, either as a result of SGMA implementation or just groundwater depletion in the absence of SGMA, a significant portion of the agricultural land is going to have to be converted to less water intensive uses. So recent studies suggest potentially more than 500,000 acres or 200,000 plus hectares by 2040. If that is delayed, if the water restrictions don't go into effect until later in this 20-year period, it could well be more. If we dig the hole deeper in terms of groundwater depletion, then it's going to require a sharper change in the other direction, basically, to get back to sustainability. So this is going, one way or another, this is going to be probably the largest change in terms of land use in the San Joaquin Valley, certainly this generation and maybe even this century. It's going to be a significant change, but there is also potentially an opportunity for conservation on a much larger scale than what any of us have been able to do so far in the San Joaquin Valley. A 2019 study from the Nature Conservancy looking at land that had already been fallowed, not due to SGMA, but due to other water or salinity issues, found 61,000 hectares that would have high potential for habitat restoration. They were only looking at one species, the blunt-nosed leopard lizard, looking at other threatened or endangered species like the San Joaquin kit fox. There would potentially be many more opportunities, and looking more broadly in terms of ecosystem connectivity and restoring some of what has been lost over the past couple of centuries as this land has been fragmented and altered in the ways that it has, for agricultural productivity. There's a significant opportunity here. Next slide. But to do this, basically, we need to, it's not enough to just let SGMA implementation play out by itself. We need to take a strategic approach, and there needs to be coordination between all the different stakeholders involved. And basically the issue is if we just let the process play out, if there's no coordination mechanism, then you have individual farmers throughout the region hearing from their GSAs eventually that they're going to have less water available. So each farmer has to make a decision. What land am I going to retire? What am I going to do with my remaining water? And basically you end up with just disconnected parcels, 40 acres here, 80 acres there. So what we need is a way to overcome this collective action problem. And we're not going to be able to do it coercively and say, all the farmers in the region we want to conserve, you all have to retire all of your farmland and the others don't have to retire any. We basically need a way to provide incentives or create a market to make this happen. Next slide. And this is something that I can see my time's getting a little short, but just very briefly, this is something that SRT has been working on basically since SGMA passed in 2014, building partnerships, not only with farmers and other conservation groups like the Nature Conservancy, but reaching out to water agencies, serving on groundwater sustainability agencies in the stakeholder or advisory capacity, reaching out to public and private funders. And really in terms of next steps, a lot of conservation planning work has been done or is in process. It really, at this point, is about establishing funding streams to make this happen. And obviously going into what may be a global economic depression that is, this is not necessarily a great time to be asking for money, but we are certainly continuing those conversations at the state and even federal level. And hopefully by the time we meet in Barcelona next year, I will have a little more to report on that. So I think my time might be about up. So we'll just go to the next slide. I look forward to answering any questions you have later in the session.
Thank you, Adam. That was a fascinating presentation. I mean, there is a massive amount of farmland which is going to be retired in the next 10, 20, 30 years. And I know that the world will be watching California to see how it manages that transition. I know that there will be huge water equity issues as well as farmland retirement issues. Who gets water for drinking? How is it distributed? How does the water rights legal structure that's been in place in California for many, many decades, how does that change over time? So I would encourage the audience, please, to enter your questions. We have a single question in the queue right now, and there are an endless number of questions that emanate from all of these presentations, including Adam's. So with that, I want to introduce Eva Weihinger. Eva is currently a student at the Humboldt University of Berlin, where she is studying sustainable development and sustainable societies in her integrated natural resource management master's program. Eva has spent a couple of years looking for us at the restoration of a large waterway in Northeast Germany that is in the vicinity of Berlin, and the progression of that story over time has really been fascinating. She works directly with Tilman Disselhoff at NABU, which is the German affiliate of BirdLife International, and herself brings a lot of expertise and experience in the field. So Eva, please proceed.
Yeah, hello everyone. I hope you can see my video now. Thank you for the introduction and for the very interesting presentations we saw so far. I'm going to present you the restoration of the lower Havel waterway, which is a large-scale river restoration project implemented by NABU, which is one of the biggest nature conservation organizations and the German chapter of BirdLife International. I've been working with NABU supporting the ELCN, so I'm not personally involved in the project, but I did some research on the project last year when I wrote a paper for the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy, and I'm looking forward to present this project to you. The Havel River is actually an interesting example showing that the priorities in Europe partly drifted away from only being focused on transport and gray infrastructure for flood protection. And this project also shows that a natural river ecosystem can provide biological diversity and habitat together with recreational value and natural and at the same time effective flood protection at the same time. On the next slide, I have a map for you where you can see where the Havel River is located. It's actually located in the northeastern part of Germany, quite in the center of Europe, and flowing through a very flat and sandy area. And after having passed Berlin, the river turns west and northwest, where it discharges into the Elbe River, one of the biggest rivers in Germany, and flowing towards the city of Hamburg and into the North Sea. It's about 334 kilometers long, and shortly before flowing into the Elbe River, the Havel River flows through one of the most important non-coastal wetland areas in the western part of Central Europe, which is also where the restoration project is implemented. yeah, about 80 kilometers from Berlin. As you can see on the next slide, the Havel River is actually a quite typical example for many rivers in Germany and Europe. So it had long been a very important waterway connecting Berlin to the sea, and in times of the division of Germany, it was intensively used for cargo shipping between Western Germany and Berlin. So the entire area had actually been heavily modified for the construction and maintenance of shipping channels. The water level has been regulated by weirs and water gates, and the river was basically cut off from its floodplain for both agricultural melioration and flood protection, resulting in major losses of the natural river dynamics and a lot of other related effects. But yeah, nevertheless, the ecological importance of the Lower Havel River and its adjacent lowlands has always remained. So nature conservationists were actually successful in achieving the legal protection of some parts of the area, for example, as a Ramsar site or within the European Union's Natura 2000 protected areas network. But yeah, despite the official protection status, the wetlands and the river ecosystem were severely degraded at the end of the last century. So conservationists took the opportunity when the Lower Havel waterway lost its importance as a waterway, and they initiated a large-scale river restoration project. So on the next slide, you can see the vision of the project, which is actually to restore a near natural river landscape and its adjacent wetlands. And of course, besides the benefits for biodiversity, the project is actually also interesting regarding natural flood prevention for downstream cities and infrastructure. It contributes to improve the water quality. It supports the re-wetting of some adjacent peatlands, and it also increases the recreational value of the entire area. So how is this achieved? On the next slide, I would like to give you a short overview on the measures that are being implemented. So starting in 2010, bank enforcements were removed, floodplains were again connected to the river. Also, the connectivity within the river was improved, for example, by removing weirs, and also the remaining weirs were used for a more dynamic management of the water level. Cut-off meanders were connected to the river again, floodplain forests planted again, and also sustainable land use was being promoted. All in all, these measures will cost around 80 million euros. The lion's share of it financed by the German Environmental Ministry and the two federal states of Brandenburg and Saxony-Anhalt, but also with financial sources from NABU and some additional funding sources, for example, from the municipalities and from companies. So now I would like to highlight some of the challenges. So one quite huge barrier that had to be overcome was actually the institutional and administrative framework under which the waterway has been administered. So in Germany, we are still in a situation where rivers are treated as a major infrastructure for transportation, even though the reality in many of them, many of them have lost their importance for freight shipping. So there are actually a lot of regulations in place that have to be dealt with, and that do not even take into account river restoration, which also cost a lot of work in this project. Yeah, and dealing with water authorities is also sometimes tricky when parts of the river are within two federal states, And yeah, small scale ownership structures require a lot of bargaining and paperwork. And of course, as for many nature conservation projects, a lot of different stakeholder interests had to be dealt with. And especially before the project implementation, with a significant share of people who were quite skeptical about the project. So what made the project finally successful? On the next slide, I would like to show you some of the success factors. So, for example, what is very important in this project is that many nature conservationists showed a long-term commitment and have been present in the area. Also, the project office is right next to the river. And for example, the current project leader has already been involved in the efforts to protect the river for several decades, which also helped to build trust and to show reliability among authorities. And for example, one important principle of this project is that only measures are implemented that have been previously agreed upon by, for example, by municipal parliaments. Lobbying and networking had also been going on long before the project had started. And in the beginning, there was a lot of volunteer work also to bring the project into life. And yeah, the project office is actually also quite flexible with implementing these measures. So the entire river restoration measures have been planned along like about 90 kilometers, but they are implemented as soon as the money is available. And yeah, an important part is also the intense stakeholder involvement. So for example, already in the planning phase, there was a project advisory group comprising 130 institutional members coming up with several binding declarations. And in the preparatory phase between 2005 and 2009, there were, for example, also 90 municipal events organized, several events at each spot to provide information, to present intermediate results, and also to finally adopt the measures that were planned. So yeah, to sum it up, the restoration of the lower Havel River is actually a pioneer project in large-scale restoration of heavily modified waterways in Europe. The project has paved the way for further restoration projects, now also fueled by the EU Water Framework Directive, and in Germany by some additional funds for the restoration of river ecosystems. The project is a great example also to show that natural flood protection is possible and that parts of the grey infrastructure for flood protection can be replaced without adverse effects on the surrounding settlements. The high benefits for biological diversity are quite obvious, especially as near natural river ecosystems have become quite rare within the European Union. And yeah, furthermore, the restored river is becoming a more and more attractive location for visitors and residents. So yeah, the project will hopefully serve as a model for restoring more rivers, lakes, and wetlands in the EU and maybe also in other parts of the world as well. So yeah, thank you very much for your attention, and I will hand back to Jim, and I'm also looking forward to any questions you might have about the project.
Thank you, Ava. That was very good and very comprehensive. It underscores the point that I have the chance to make to younger people that we help to instruct through the Alpine Network at the Lincoln Institute, the Academics for Land Protection in New England, which is that these projects take a lot of time. They take a lot of collaboration between hundreds and hundreds of organizations. I think the River Havel is a perfect example of that. And you have this green infrastructure, literally, as the picture shows, running right through Northeast Germany now as a result of that perseverance and that success in this project implementation. So congratulations. Now, finally, we have Spencer Meyer. I've been working with Spencer for more than a decade, and he is pioneering a new method for protecting a watershed in New England with some very interesting partners. Not only is he getting the local water supplier involved and citizens group, but he's employing breweries that depend on clear water to help support the effort. And I have tasted the beer brewed from this source, and I have to say it's very good. So Spencer, please tell us your story.
Great. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all of you. First off, I want to say thank you to the ILCN and ELCN networks for inviting all of us to share our work with you today. I think the breadth of projects that are bringing together forest and water and agriculture is really exciting. And I just want to say I've learned a lot over the years from being part of panels exactly like this, where we learn from each other and we share information. And I can think of parts of our project that have been inspired by panels just like this in the past. I also want to say that I work individually at the Highstead Foundation with my colleagues at Highstead, and what I'm going to talk about today is an initiative of not just Highstead, but many of our partner organizations, and that initiative is called Sebago Clean Waters. I am one of many involved in that. I'm co-chair of our executive committee, along with my colleague Tamara Lee Pinard from the Nature Conservancy, and I'll show you some logos of our other critical partners in this project later. Rest assured that I am just representing the work of many people on this initiative. What I want to talk to you about for the next 10 or so minutes is an infrastructure project, a water infrastructure project in Maine. I'll show you a map of where in just a minute. And what you see here on the screen is the primary filtration plant for the Portland Water District. Maine is a rural state in the northeast corner of the United States. And Portland is the major city where a good portion of the whole population lives down in the corner. And this is where they get their drinking water from. This is their primary filtration plant. The Environmental Protection Agency in the United States has granted only about 50 water utilities in the country with a filtration avoidance waiver, which essentially means the conditions of the watershed where the forest, where the water comes from, is healthy and intact and functioning enough that the water does not need any secondary filtration, as is common with all the other water utilities, surface water utilities in the United States. Here's the map of where we are, laid on a map of United States water funds. We've seen the global map from Jaime and the Nature Conservancy, and here's the map for the United States. We're one of many, and one of the things that I hope will become apparent is that our water fund, and there are a couple examples of this, but not many, where the real goal here is to keep an existing watershed that is intact, to keep it intact proactively. We are not working in a watershed that is heavily degraded. We do not have water quality problems as of yet. But in fact, we're trying to prove the case that you can start with a healthy natural filtration plant for water and keep it that way through a water fund mechanism and through all the partner and collaborative work that I'm going to explain to you shortly. The primary resource concern in this watershed is encroaching development, urbanization, and conversion of forests to other uses, whether it's for energy corridors or second home development, particularly lakefront and riverfront second home development. This map of the northeastern United States is from a now dated but still important United States Forest Service study that identified watersheds that are predominantly privately owned, have important water quality functioning of their forest, and the risk of that privately owned forest is a risk, in fact, to the water quality itself. And so this watershed experiences that current and future threat, but is not currently degraded. And so what we've done as Sebago Clean Waters is come together as a group of partners representing small local land trust, regional and national and international conservation NGOs, and very importantly, the Portland Water District. I know, talking to other water fund colleagues around, that sometimes the goal is to get a water utility at the table, and we are very fortunate in that we are able to start from a position where the Portland Water District, which supplies water for 1/6 of all of Maine's population, already has this watershed protection in their DNA. And while they don't want to own vast tracts of lands themselves, except in the most important areas right along the lake, they are very supportive and indeed help finance the protection through ownership or through conservation easements of private forest land within the watershed. The map here is the watershed itself. It's about 300,000 acres, the Sebago watershed, where Portland, Maine is actually off the map to the bottom and to the right of the map. So the watershed itself is physically disconnected, but of course the water flows through the watershed, through the Crooked River, into the Sebago Lake, which is itself very clean and has on the order of 100 years worth of water sitting in the lake right now. And so we're talking about a very healthy watershed, and the pitch for this water fund is really about keeping it that way. And one thing we've tried to do here is to shift a common conservation planning narrative is to enumerate all the things we have and then decide how we go and protect them and who would want to be part of protecting them. And one thing we're trying to do a bit here is to shift the narrative to what is the demand for the water or the resources that are coming from this watershed? Who are those beneficiaries? And what is the value proposition to them, why they should come to the table to help conserve this watershed? So the process is long, as all of my co-presenters know here, and there's just countless collaborations and conversations that go on behind the scenes. But here's how we thought about the basic process of developing the water fund. The first is to understand the needs of the communities within the watershed. And it's important to note here that the watershed itself, culturally and demographically and economically, is quite different from the downstream urban areas of Portland where people actually drink the water. And it's a more rural, less economically benefited region. And people in the watershed drink from their own water systems. Sometimes that's surface water and sometimes that's wells. But most of the communities in the watershed do not receive their water through the Portland Water District system, which serves the communities, the 11 communities downstream of the watershed. And so the goal of the water fund is really to connect the water users that themselves are outside of the watershed with largely private landowners within the watershed that are helping produce that clean water. So you have to understand the downstream and upstream needs and values of these different stakeholders. And then we've done extensive science and planning to really understand the conservation co-benefits, and of course there are many, as we've heard from my co-presenters, and to really understand the economics of how this watershed contributes to the water system itself, but also the broader economic system in the watershed and downstream. And of course, funding is on everyone's mind. We've heard that from all the presenters. And so our strategy has been to start with some core seed funding, and I'll say a bit from where, and then to build the value proposition, the case to bring on co-investors, if you will, into the water fund. So our U.S. Endowment for Forestry and Communities, in partnership with the Environmental Protection Agency and the Natural Resource Conservation Service, have been generous in providing seed funding to get Sebago Clean Waters off the ground for the first few years. In addition, all of our partners have been putting in significant both in-kind and cash contributions to this work. And through that, we've been able to attract some early business partners, notably some breweries, and also an anonymous foundation. And this has provided our first 3 to 4 years of seed funding for this initiative. I want to point out just one snapshot of our ecosystem service and economic modeling that we've done in the watershed to really understand the whole suite of co-benefits that the watershed provides. And then, as you'll see, we really focus in on the water benefits specifically. So we use the INVEST tool that probably many of you are familiar with to really do a coarse filter understanding of the various benefits. And you can see that sediment and phosphorus and nitrogen come out in all 3 of these scenarios as really important of the economic benefit associated with conserving the forest there. Air purification, that is air quality, of course, is in there importantly as well. And so when we look at all the ecosystem service benefits from a science perspective, modeling perspective, what we know is that they range between $300 and $2,000 per acre per year, or $600 or so to $4,000 per hectare per year. that are accruing in this watershed. At the same time, we know the rate at which we are losing forest, and we've been able to determine through watershed modeling the rate of forest loss that could jeopardize the filtration waiver I mentioned earlier, which would lead to significant new investments to filter this water by the Portland Water District. And so our science has shown us that probably about 8% of a forest loss in this watershed, so going from 84% forested down to about 76% forested, is the likely tipping point below which the water quality would degrade enough to require additional filtration and treatment. So if we put all that together and work with some of the businesses and large water users, what we can learn is that the water rates, if the filtration plant were needed, would increase on the order of 84% to these businesses. And if you look across the entire customer base that is getting their clean water from Portland Water District from this watershed, that's about a $15 million per year cost to these water users associated with that threshold if it were crossed because of degradation and forest loss. So we've begun to work with some of these businesses, particularly the ones whose core products are heavily reliant on water. That's not just the breweries, it's also semiconductors and medical facilities and others that are reliant on extra clean water. And we've started to build out this value proposition, which I'll run through you for just a minute here. So we know that it costs us about $2,000 per hectare to protect the land in various forms through easement or acquisition. And we know that about $1,700 is accruing every year in these collective set of ecosystem service benefits, not all of which people are willing to pay for that we know so well. We know that losing 8% of the forest cover would increase it enough pollution that a filtration plant would be involved, which would cost about $13 million per year in capital costs to finance that filtration plant. And as I mentioned, we know that the water rates would trickle down to individual users, not just commercial water users, but also individual residential and communities that buy all their water from Portland specifically. And so at the end of this, what we understand is that if we took just 10% of these avoided costs or these savings, that would be enough to finance over the next 10 years our protection goal of 25% of this watershed. So we've been using all that information and all the co-benefits that I haven't spent much time on here to put together some marketing materials, not just for broad marketing purposes, but also to work with individual business leaders as we've been doing over the last several months. Now, one important lesson from this work is that you need to be resilient. And in the current times that we have, both from a pandemic perspective and also from a social unrest perspective, the value proposition specifically about the cost of water is not on the top of everyone's minds. And so we have to be flexible and understand the complete set of benefits that are brought to the communities. So just a couple of summary points here. So far, we've raised for land protection projects and operations $2.4 million. We've legally protected just under 2,000 acres or 900 hectares. We have 2 business partners that have signed on with multi-year commitments tied to the volume of water that they use. We have brought significant new capacity in terms of staff time to the local land trusts that actually implement these projects. And we've encouraged the Portland Water District, and they have been very bold in this new initiative and created a new resolution to increase their overall contributions to the watershed. Now, one last point is that just yesterday, in partnership with the Conservation Fund, Sebago Clean Waters released the news that the Conservation Fund is acquiring 15,000 acres of a working forest in the upper part of the watershed, 3,000 acres of which are going to be directly involved in the Sebago Clean Waters Initiative over the next 5 years. That'll include 33 miles or 50 so kilometers of river frontage on the Crooked River, which brings the water down through this watershed. And I'm out of time on my lessons learned, but I know many of these will come up in the Q&A period. But again, I want to stress the resiliency and understanding your multiple value propositions to different audiences. And I want to thank our early adopters, as I mentioned, our funders earlier, Allagash Brewing, Foundation Brewing, an anonymous foundation, and the U.S. Endowment Healthy Watersheds Consortium. So thank you for your time, and I look forward to discussion.
Thank you, Spencer. Again, a very persistent group of people pulling off significant land conservation and water protection in an era where we have so many other problems to think about. So congratulations for your persistence and for your recent successes, and all wishes for the same in the future. Now we have a set of questions that Tillman and I are going to tag team on. I'll read the first, and Tillman will read the second, and so on. And we'll go for about 15 more minutes until our time is up. I also want to note that in the chat section, we had Emily Simmons report to all panelists that in case there's interest, there's a Water Funds network that the Nature Conservancy runs at waterfundstoolbox.org. All one word, waterfundstoolbox.org/network. So there's a resource for you if you're interested in expanding this community of practice around the world. And I'm going to ask the first question from Vidya Tiku, who asks for Adam, what is the profile, racial and economic, of the farmers that are looking at potential closures? How are we planning or currently addressing issues around racial equity for land ownership and food access? And I think this equity issue is one that's, of course, larger than just California. It's one that the whole world is really very interested in now. So Adam, do you want to address that question, please?
Yeah, and it definitely is an issue in the San Joaquin Valley. To answer the first part of the question, basically the landowners, like the people who actually own the farms, are disproportionately white, and the farm workers, like the people who actually pick the vegetables and that, that kind of thing, are disproportionately people of color and specifically immigrants, as well. So, and that is, I mean, certainly the San Joaquin Valley has probably some of the most dramatic disparities in terms of, I mean, it's one of the most diverse regions of California and the nation, but has some of the most dramatic disparities in terms of wealth and land ownership, impacts as far as environmental degradation and water scarcity. One of the things that actually led to the passage of SGMA during the drought was basically entire communities losing access to water, like just not having safe drinking water because their wells went dry, due to the drought. And that was part of what made groundwater depletion had been going on for a long time, and there were all kinds of issues in terms of land subsidence going back decades. But, part of what made the problem impossible to ignore was just literally entire communities losing access to drinking water overnight. So yeah, those are very significant issues. And I cannot say that we or necessarily anyone else, has, that we have solved those problems. And certainly, inherent in the idea of setting up incentive structures to compensate farmers for retiring farmland. I mean, obviously, that is, some of that funding would ultimately be going to the owners of this, of the land, because I mean, they're the ones who, rightly or wrongly, will be making the decisions, on an individual basis about what we're going to do with water and land. So yes, this is definitely a real issue, and it's something we grapple with as a land trust, and thinking about our own, how we do conservation projects, and how do we, if we're giving a farmer or rancher, a huge amount of money, or acting as a conduit for that, to conserve something, is what can we do to see that money actually stays in the community, or some of it.
All right. Thank you. Does anyone else on the panel want to address equity issues involved in their project? No volunteers. All right, it's a hard question.
we only have equity issues in California.
Not at all. Tillman, the next question.
All right, the next question comes from an anonymous participant and it is directed at Spencer. We're referring to the economics. You were making a very compelling case for preemptive conservation of these resources. Can you specify the methodological basis basically for the prices you were putting on nitrate retention, phosphorus retention, and habitat conservation?
Sure, thanks for the question. I can do better than describe it. I can put a link in the chat as soon as I get done talking and share the study that we did that we've published on our newly launched website, which means it's going to take me a second to find the new URL. But for that exact purpose, because a lot of other people have been interested in how we did that. The short answer is we started with the INVEST ecosystem service modeling platform that works really great in some places and not so great in other places, but needs a lot of local calibration, a lot of local information. And the white paper version of what I said will explain some more of the details. I'm happy to follow up with anyone. We did that in partnership with the University of Maine, some economists and scientists there that had the time and expertise to help us implement that. So maybe I'll just share the link to it and someone can get in touch with me offline for more information.
Very good.
Thank you.
Elena, whose last name begins with S, asks a question of Fernando. Chile and Los Limpios, we have a private protected area mainly focusing on native forest ecosystem restoration located in ILCN near a glacier called Lake Leones. Tourism pressure on the lake is growing exponentially. We cooperate with CONAF on the issue as the lake is in a national park, but their resources are quite limited. Would it be possible for us to link somehow with the Lagos Limpios project?
I think there's a simple answer for that. Yes. I would be happy to speak with Elena after this. Although our initial territorial approach is in northern Patagonia, so it ends up in Los Lagos. We know that there's a lot of fresh water in ILCN. Actually, if you go down from ILCN all the way to the end of the country, that's the 60% of freshwater reserve. So yes, I would be happy to talk with Elena.
Which only goes to prove the point that conservation can often be contagious. Thank you for your answer. Tillman, next question.
The next question comes from Diego Tabilo from Chile. Hi, Diego. Good that you're with us today. The question goes to Jamie, and it's about whether you have involved water utilities in your water fund program in Latin America, or if you know of any examples where water utilities have been involved. And he's asking basically because he says that the regulations that would facilitate the functioning of water in Chile are still pending because the cost efficiencies of such a program has not yet proved there. So can you help him with that? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much for the question. Yes, I don't know the exact case for Chile, but I do know that in Latin America, there are excellent cases of water utilities participating in water funds. For example, in Colombia, we have Medellin, Bucaramanga, we have Camboriú, Sao Paulo, Brasilia in Brazil. We have also Yaque del Norte in República Dominicana, and Mendoza and Argentina. Those are excellent examples of water utilities. And what I know most, that it's in Ecuador, we have different situations even in the same country. So it's a case by case analysis. You know, for example, in Quito, we have an ordinance in which the water company has to put 2% of their sales in the water fund. So it's a legal ordinance. But then you have other places in Ecuador where that's more voluntary, and they have different schemes in order for water utilities. to participate. I just want to emphasize another thing is that with the all this waterfront with FONAC in Quito, we have developed, for example, and this is I think this is a good opportunity to work with water utilities. We develop a return on investment analysis for the water company to understand what is the economic benefit of participating in a waterfront. And it was very nice. It was a very nice and positive study, and they're more involved now than before because they have this economic information.
Thank you very much. Last question, and then we will adjourn this session. From an anonymous attendee, has there been planning, and this is for Adam, has there been planning to assess how to replace the ag production capacity that will be lost or displaced from the extensive change in farmland use in the valley in the face of SGMA? Where will that ag production go? And what threats to other land or geographic areas will that pose?
The short answer is no, and some of it might never come back. I mean, the farmland in this part of the world is, I mean, for a variety of reasons in terms of the geological history and just composition of the soil. I mean, it really is some of the most productive agricultural land in the world. So, I mean, the way things look now, some of that will be lost, and I don't know that there's necessarily any other land that is now being unused that can easily substitute for that. I think that, and maybe this is a topic for a future conference, you know, certainly California and the San Joaquin Valley, I mean, these are not the only places facing issues in terms of water scarcity and in terms of having to change or scale back agriculture to live within our means, you know, as far as fresh water use. So I think that maybe hints at a larger question about food security and population that you know, would be maybe a very sobering conversation to have, but would be a good conversation to have at some point.
All right. Well, I want to take this chance to thank all of our panelists who have a great deal of expertise that they're bringing to this presentation, and I want to acknowledge that they are wrestling, as all of us are, with some very weighty and complicated problems that the next generation of managers will also have to deal with, and hopefully we're making good headway on setting the foundation for some of those solutions at present. I want to thank all the participants for being with us today and for hearing what these people have to say. And I want to, Chani, if you have the last slide, I want to remind you that the last session of this 10-session webinar series that began on Earth Day 2020, and it will conclude this month, will be on inspiring partnerships in stewardship. It will occur on Wednesday, June 24th at 4 p.m. or 1600 Eastern Standard Time and 2200 Central European Standard Time. So I invite all of you to participate in that and then to rejoin us in the fall when we start ELCN and ILCN webinars, probably at a once a month frequency this fall. And we're just beginning to plan those now. So if you have ideas for those, please let us know and we will take them into consideration. Again, thank you all so much for your participation. Have a good afternoon or a good evening, and we look forward to seeing many of you next week. Goodbye.